There are a few defining choices in the childhood of every millennial. And one of those, if you're like me, was whether you are a Halo fan or a Call of Duty fan. If you know what a 4-shot is, you chose correctly. Now, this is not a video about Halo, even though it was a fantastic game franchise. It was some of the most fun you could have in high school if you were a nerd. But this is actually about the setting and how it inspired me, because the setting of Halo, I think, is actually an incredibly underrated setting. Partly that's because after Bungie sold the rights, it was ruined. Let's not talk about that. Halo ended at Reach. There is nothing else past that. It didn't happen, okay? But they actually had some novels, and I read them back in high school, and they left a surprisingly deep impression on me with the portrayal of far future space opera scale. But it's not a ripoff of Star Trek. It's not a ripoff of Star Wars. This was military sci-fi at its core, about first contact going horribly, horribly wrong. And it creates a desperate situation building up into the games where they managed to justify that, yeah, it kind of can come down to one man. Very lucky. This is also the era of the silent protagonist, which seems to be a lost art form. Except for Nintendo still understands that Link is a silent protagonist. Now, Master Chief, of course, the best Space Marine variant, fight me. He's not completely silent, but he doesn't bandy. He's not quipping. He's not making jokes. He's not having trauma moments. He does what has to be done. He's a soldier. He fights for humanity, fights for the other Marines at his side, and so on. He does what he has to do, and he saves everyone. Not all the soldiers necessarily, but you know what? He wins the war, okay? Halo is not a dystopian setting, even though it is a desperate war setting. And I think that's one of the big charms of it, is that there always is the ability to get a good counteroffensive. Especially when you start adding extra variables like the Flood and the Forerunners. God. Sorry, Halo Reach came out a long time ago. And realistically, all this stuff, all these elements are super common, but I just think Halo executed them super well. And that is why when I looked for inspiration in how to build my spacefaring story settings, because I do want to write that stuff. I want to write everything, okay? But I used Halo as the primary inspiration. You know, I took a little from Star Wars, took a little from let's say Battlestar Galactica, a little bit from Ian M. Banks' Culture series, a lot from actual physics speculation. But I'll be honest, it's mostly Halo. Right down to, in my second book, Ship of Fools, the main character, Space Ranger Marcus Maximus, is basically my take on the role that Master Chief could have. Essentially, I'm not gonna lie, it's the direct inspiration. It's obviously very different though, so don't sue me. But this was my second book. I wanted to contrast the more grounded cyberpunk setting of Faceless, or Bastion Black Sun Book 1, which is so close to reality you could almost tell the story in reality. But I wanted to push the limits of what can be imagined and build that all up so I can have far more exotic science fiction stories ready and good to go. And then I built it all up, and then the scale kind of reduced, because in my opinion, a good hard science fiction system, you actually need to establish a lot. And if you're taking the time to establish things such as how does faster than light work, what is the political situation, how fast do people get around, what role does virtual reality have, artificial intelligence, cloning, genetic engineering, war, aliens, etc. There's just so much that goes into a full space opera setting that I kind of had to narrowed down my focus quite a bit. And I wanted to come to a story with a point as well. And the honest story behind Ship of Fools here is, aside from this being a reference to the allegory of democracy is a ship of fools in the night, where the captain is short-sighted and dumb and everyone else thinks they should steer the ship, through the mist and the storm and between the rocks, they say they're the ones to do it. I think you can imagine how he thought democracy would go when everyone thinks that they are qualified to be the captain. Of course, they weren't really super enthused on what we envision democracy as, but it's a slightly different story. I wrote this book just after actually the J6 event because that insurrection really left me wondering what is the circumstances wherein the military should step in and depose the standing government. This happens all over the world, and maybe I would have done better to do more research on the various actual military coups that have happened, mostly in Africa, of course. And you're going to notice that's a recurring theme. Every time I look back on a book, I'm going to go, I could have researched something more. There is infinite research you can do to tell your story. I think any writer seriously approaching the craft and wanting to tell they're trying to do something more than chase a market trend. I'm pretty sure they will all agree that there is an unlimited amount that you could study and think about and tweak and learn before finishing the book to like a perfect standard. But it's also a little odd to like actually do that much research. You'd never release anything. So looking back on it, yeah, sure, I wish I had researched military coups more. But I structured this book, Ship of Fools, as a microcosm allegory of the systems breaking down and the chaos that erupts because of it, and did my best to tell a story around that. The A plot of the story is that Space Ranger Marcus Maximus is essentially on the run because his side of the space war lost. And, the winners want to arrest him and find out what kind of, space marine genetic engineering they did on him. He's basically on the run when the station gets blown up by a unannounced attack, and he and 1,000 other people are stranded on a refugee ship awaiting pickup from Faster Than Light. They've sent out the distress beacon, but their ship doesn't have Faster Than Light because they're on a shuttle. Not everyone was able to get off. The problem is that the people that then take over the stellar system are the bad guys that would sooner blow up refugees than take them prisoner, because that's just a risk that they're not willing to take. And that becomes the crux of the decision-making process. At some point, they need to turn on the beacon to say, we're not space debris, we're survivors, come rescue us. And all they can do is signal whoever is in charge of the stellar system. So they have to send out an electromagnetic burst and say, help. And if they accidentally signal bad guys, they can all get killed. If they signal good guys, they might get rescued. If they do nothing, they'll survive a bit longer, and maybe they'll be more certain in the future. That problem is the single issue problem that I use to represent basically the mismanagement or proper management of governance. And instead of an entire bureaucracy, it comes down to who is the captain of the ship. Is it the government-appointed captain who was ordained to be in charge of the ship and, space maritime laws says he's in charge? What about when he starts failing? The people under him say he's in dereliction of duty. When do they have the right to depose him? Well, there's some standards for that. There comes a point where the second in command can take charge. And the way that's typically handled is basically there has to be a review afterwards by other unrelated people. They look at the evidence, they look at the decision, they say, hey, you did the right thing, or you completely violated the law, you are getting punished severely for that. And, that makes sense. That's a kind of succession that happens. What about when that fails? Who takes over then? What if everyone with an official right to be in charge of the government and be the captain of the ship is incapable of doing it? Or at least, what if they seem incapable? What right do the people surviving on the ship have in who's the captain? Because the question of the distress beacon is solely in the hands of the captain, because that's how the ship functions, right? And I tell the story through Space Ranger Marcus Max's viewpoint because he basically represents the military. He is the only person on the ship that has a mastery of violence. Nobody can seriously threaten him, and if he needed to, not that he would, because he is supposed to be a traditionally strong, heroic character of wisdom, good judgment, etc. But if he needed to, everyone is aware he could kill everyone on the ship, and no one would be able to stop him, except his own conscience. With the exception of, he can't be captain. The ship is hard-coded to not accept his commands as captain. And he doesn't want to be, because that's not his role. He recognizes that's not his role. He's not the decision maker. He is basically a soldier. A soldier with arguably quite a bit of PTSD, but that gets into, the character dynamics going through the story, which, okay, I think I did just fine with the character developments, mostly. But that's the story, is the breakdown of society, the growing chaos, the way resources get spent, squandered, used as political favors, and then exhausted, and what happens then. So you may have picked up that this is kind of close to being a political rant, and I stand by it to date so far. I don't think I portrayed anything particularly wrong. It's obviously simplified. Like, you could argue it's a contrived scenario, but that's just the kind of story it is. But that doesn't mean it's like a perfect book. It's not for everyone. I don't even know what genre it is, to be honest. I sort of call it military sci-fi, but like the vast majority of the tension is like back and forth mutinies. It's not exactly swarms of space marines charging alien fortifications, right? But it kind of is at the same time. It's also like hide and seek cat and mouse with nuclear missiles in the dark, which not many sci-fi stories, to my knowledge, actually treat ship-to-ship combat as relativistic missile hunting, even though that's most likely what it's going to be when we eventually get there with actual modern human technology. It's dangerous as hell to be on a ship in a war scenario. That said, though, I'm not just talking up my book, although if you're interested in this so far and you like the things that I like and the things that were on my mind about this and you want to give it a shot, link is in the description. This is me advertising my book. Now, after you've clicked away because you're a good buyer, I'm going to kind of own up to some of the facts that it's a little scuffed in places. Two major things went wrong with this book in hindsight. The first is pretty simple to explain. A lot of the characters with a claim to have the right to be in charge of the ship kind of are older men with leadership experience. Because, like, you've got the business CEO, you've got the priest, you've got the captain and his hierarchy, and you've got like the scientist character, and you name it. The stereotypes that you could imagine are all at play, and they all kind of have they all kind of sound the same. Is the problem, because they swim in the same circles, was my mindset at the time. But it ended up with a samey texture where you couldn't immediately identify who was speaking, whose position they were taking, and so on. They just weren't differentiated enough. And I just got said, it's just simply basically an amateur writing mistake. I think I've gotten past that with my future. But it's something that happened. I recognize that it happened. I should have mixed it up more. But I was more focused on trying to play out the political chaos better and get all the technology correct. Should have done that better. Oh well. But the first half of the book, in hindsight, little tiny bit dry. And I say that because it would have been pretty easy to make it really tight. The issue I had was that because waiting for rescue was almost always the right call, therefore doing nothing was the smart move. So for a lot of the story, the main character is just sitting back and restraining himself and advising other people to restrain themselves and just wait. But that makes for a boring story. And simply put, like there just should have been a problem solver B plot. That problem solving plots are something that are really obvious if you think about it, and they just pace well, even though they're incredibly simple. You establish an overall goal, such as keep the ship operating until rescue arrives. Now, then you say, X, Y, and Z are broken. We're leaking air, we're running low on uranium, the fusion reactors are running low, and our spin is destabilized. And then you go, okay, well, we're going to prioritize the sequence that we're going to fix these, and we're just going to knock this down, then this down, then this down. And you have stuff happening around that as you look at it constantly as, here's a problem, here's an obstacle, here's the character solving, overcoming the obstacle, solving the problem, and it's done. That's in the rear view. Let's move on to the next problem because we're on a clock. Because hey, don't you know, we're dropping temperature. Everyone's going to die of pneumonia. We're running out of antibiotics. We got to solve this. We got to solve that. We got to get the food going. And if I had actually just laid that out as problem solving rather than like this looming threat of decay, the pacing would have just been significantly faster and tighter. And I could have had the same overall political decay plot beats at the same time. And it just would have been better broke. I don't have an excuse for it, really. I just recognize that it would have been better if I had done that. But I stand by the second half is quite good when people start boarding the ship and there's giant robots and raids and blackouts and, they get brought in by other crews and so on. Good stuff happens. Like, the book is solid military sci-fi stuff, in my opinion. It just has some issues brought on by the nature of the story I was trying to tell and the fact that, well, I could have been better. I definitely could have executed that better. But this is my first establishment into my space opera tech tier, let's call it. I'm definitely coming back to this. I'm going to write a sequel. I'm going to write at least one novella related to another area, another aftermath of the war. And I'm considering writing a full space opera series about some of the other characters that are mentioned in this book. But, I'll let Ranger Maximus wrap up his plot line. I spent so long tweaking my rules of Faster Than Light to get it to just the right level of freedom, but also control, narrative options, and so on. I'm very happy with how I executed Faster Than Light. So I'm going to just keep using it. The technology suite that I established in Ship of Fools is going to work perfectly for me for every space opera need I can imagine. And I look forward to writing those books. The next one will be coming out next year, hopefully, that novella I mentioned. And I hope you'll check that out if anything I've said so far has been of interest to you. Like I said, the link to my second book, Ship of Fools, is in the description. So drop a comment if you were also a Halo player growing up, though. Till then, cheers.